Dear friends and students, you are listening to the book Glimpses of World History by the legendary Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Chapter 51. From Harsha to Mahmud in North India. June 1st, 1932. We must interrupt our story of the Arabs or Saracens and have a look at other countries. What was happening in India, in China, and in the countries of Europe, while the Arabs grew in power and conquered and spread, and then declined? Some little glimpses we have already had. The defeat of the Arabs at Tours in France in 732 by a joint army under Charles Martel, their conquest of Central Asia, and their coming up to Sindh in India. Let us first turn to India. Harshavardhana of Kannauj died in 648 AC, and with his death, the political degeneration of North India became more obvious. For some time past, this had been going on, and the conflict between Hinduism and Buddhism had helped the process. During Harsha's time, there was outwardly a brave show, but for a while only. After him, a number of small states grew up in the north, sometimes enjoying a brief glory, sometimes quarreling with each other. It is curious that even in these 300 years or more after Harsha, art and literature flourished, and there were many fine public works constructed. Several famous Sanskrit writers like Bhavabhuti and Rajashekhara lived in these times, and several kings, not important politically, were famous for the art and learning which grew under them. One of these rulers, Raja Bhoja, has become almost a mythical type of the model king, and even today, people refer to him as such. But in spite of these bright spots, the north was declining. South India was again taking the lead and overshadowing the north. I have told you a little of the south in these days in a previous letter, 44, of the Chalukyas and the Chola Empire, and the Pallavas and the Rashtrakutas. I have also told you of Shankaracharya, who in a short life managed to impress both the learned and the unlearned all over the country, and almost succeeded in putting an end to Buddhism in India. Strange that even as he did so, a new religion should knock at the gates of India, and later come in a flood of conquest to challenge the existing order. The Arabs reached the borders of India soon enough, even while Harsha was alive. They stopped there for a while and then took possession of Sindh. In 710 AC, a young boy of 17, Muhammad ibn Qasim, commanding an Arab army, conquered the Indus Valley up to Multan in western Punjab. This was the full extent of the Arab conquest of India. Perhaps if they had tried hard enough, they might have gone farther. It should not have been difficult, as North India was weak. But, although there was plenty of fighting going on between these Arabs and the neighboring rulers, there was no organized attempt at conquest. Politically, therefore, this Arab conquest of Sindh was not an important affair. The Muslim conquest of India was to come several hundred years later. But culturally, the contact of the Arabs with the people of India had great results. The Arabs had friendly relations with the Indian rulers of the south, especially the Rashtrakutas. Many Arabs settled along the west coast of India and built mosques in their settlements. Arab travelers and traders visited various parts of India. Arab students came in large numbers to the Northern University of Takshashila or Takshila, which was especially famous for medicine. It is said that in the days of Harun al-Rashid, Indian scholarship had a high place in Baghdad, and physicians from India went there to organize hospitals and medical schools. Many Sanskrit books on mathematics and astronomy were translated into Arabic. Thus, the Arabs took much from the old Indo-Aryan culture. They took also much from the Aryan culture of Persia, and also something from Hellenic culture. They were almost like a new race, in the prime of their vigor, and they took advantage of all the old cultures they saw around them, and learned from them. And on this foundation, they built something of their very own, the Saracenic culture. This had a comparatively brief life, as cultures go, but it was a brilliant life which shines against the dark background of the Middle Ages in Europe. It is strange to find that while the Arabs profited by their contacts with Indo-Aryan, Persian, and Hellenic cultures, the Indians and Persians and Greeks did not profit much by their contacts with the Arabs. Perhaps this was due to the fact that the Arabs were new and full of vigor and enthusiasm, while the others were old races going along the old ruts and not caring overmuch for change. It is curious how age seems to have the same effect on a people or a race as it has on an individual. It makes them slow of movement, inelastic in mind and body, conservative and afraid of change. So India was not greatly affected or much changed by this contact with the Arabs, which lasted for some hundreds of years. But during this long period, India must have got to know something of the new religion, Islam. Muslim Arabs came and went and built mosques, and sometimes preached their religion, and sometimes even converted people. There seems to have been no objection to this in those days, no trouble or friction between Hinduism and Islam. It is interesting to note this because in later days, friction and trouble did arise between the two religions. It was only when, in the 11th century, Islam came to India in the guise of a conqueror, sword in hand, that it produced a violent reaction, and the old toleration gave way to hatred and conflict. This wielder of the sword who came to India with fire and slaughter was Mahmud of Ghazni. Ghazni is now a little town in Afghanistan. Round about Ghazni grew up a state in the 10th century. Nominally, the Central Asian states were under the Caliph of Baghdad. But, as I have told you already, after Harun al-Rashid's death, the Caliph weakened, and a time came when his empire split up into a number of independent states. This is the period of which we are now speaking. A Turkish slave named Subuktagin carved a state for himself around Ghazni and Kandahar about 975 AC. He raided India also. In those days, a man named Jaipal was Raja of Lahore. Very venturesome, Jaipal marched to the Kabul valley against Subuktagin and got defeated. Mahmud succeeded his father Subuktagin. He was a brilliant general and a fine cavalry leader. Year after year, he raided India and sacked and killed and took away with him vast treasure and large numbers of captives. Altogether, he made 17 raids, and only one of these, into Kashmir, was a failure. The others were successful, and he became a terror all over the north. He went as far south as Pataliputra, Mathura, and Somnath. From Thaneshwara he took away, it is said, 200,000 captives and vast wealth. But it was in Somnath that he got the most treasure. For this was one of the great temples, and the offerings of centuries had accumulated there. It is said that thousands of people took refuge in the temple when Mahmud approached, in the hope that a miracle would happen and the god they worshipped would protect them. But miracles seldom occur, except in the imaginations of the faithful, and the temple was broken and looted by Mahmud, and 50,000 people perished, waiting for the miracle which did not happen. Mahmud died in 1030 AC. The whole of the Punjab and Sindh was under his sway at the time. He is looked upon as a great leader of Islam who came to spread Islam in India. Most Muslims adore him. Most Hindus hate him. As a matter of fact, he was hardly a religious man. He was a Mohammedan, of course, but that was by the way. Above everything, he was a soldier, and a brilliant soldier. He came to India to conquer and loot, as soldiers unfortunately do, and he would have done so whatever religion he might have belonged to. It is interesting to find that he threatened the Muslim rulers of Sindh, and only on their submission and payment of tribute did he spare them. He even threatened the Caliph at Baghdad with death and demanded Samarkand from him. We must therefore not fall into the common error of considering Mahmud as anything more than a successful soldier. Mahmud took large numbers of Indian architects and builders with him to Ghazni and built a fine mosque there, which he called the Celestial Bride. He was very fond of gardens. Of Mathura, Mahmud has given us a glimpse, which shows us what a great city it was. Writing to his governor at Ghazni, Mahmud says, "There are here at Mathura 1,000 edifices as firm as the faith of the faithful. Nor is it likely that this city has attained its present condition, but at the expense of many millions of dinars. Nor could such another be constructed under a period of 200 years." This description of Mathura by Mahmud we read in an account given by Firdausi. Firdausi was a great Persian poet who lived in Mahmud's time. I remember mentioning his name and the name of his chief work, the Shahnameh, in one of my letters to you last year. There is a story that the Shahnameh was written at the request of Mahmud, who promised to pay him a gold dinar, a coin, for every couplet of verses. But Firdausi, apparently, did not believe in conciseness or brevity. He wrote at tremendous length, and when he produced his many thousands of couplets before Mahmud, he was praised for his work, but Mahmud regretted the rash promise of payment he had made. He tried to pay him something much less, and Firdausi was very angry and refused to accept anything. We have taken a long step from Harsha to Mahmud, and surveyed 360 years and more of Indian history in a few paragraphs. I suppose much could be said of this long period which would be interesting. But I am ignorant of it, and so it is safer for me to preserve a discreet silence. I could tell you something of various kings and rulers who fought each other and sometimes even established large kingdoms in northern India, like the Panchala kingdom, of the trials of the great city of Kanauj, how it was assailed and captured for a while by the rulers of Kashmir, and then by the king of Bengal, and later still by the Rashtrakutas from the south. But this record would serve little purpose and would only confuse you. We have now arrived at the end of a long chapter of Indian history, and a new one begins. It is difficult, and often enough wrong, to divide up history into compartments. It is like a flowing river. It goes on and on. Still it changes, and sometimes we can see the end of one phase and the beginning of another. Such changes are not sudden. They shade off into each other. So we reach the end of an act in the unending drama of history as far as India is concerned. What is called the Hindu period is gradually drawing to a close. The Indo-Aryan culture, which had flourished for some thousands of years, has to struggle now against a newcomer. But remember that this change was not sudden. It was a slow process. Islam came to the north with Mahmud. The south was not touched by Islamic conquest for a long time to come, and even Bengal was free from it for nearly 200 years more. In the north we find Chittor, which was to be so famous in after history for its reckless gallantry, becoming a rallying point for Rajput clans. But surely and inexorably, the tide of Muslim conquest spread, and no amount of individual courage could stop it. There can be no doubt that the old Indo-Aryan India was on the decline. Being unable to check the foreigner and the conqueror, Indo-Aryan culture adopted a defensive attitude. It retired into a shell in its endeavors to protect itself. It made its caste system, which till then had an element of flexibility in it, more rigid and fixed. It reduced the freedom of its womenfolk. Even the village panchayats underwent a slow change for the worse. And yet, even as it declined before a more vigorous people, it sought to influence them and mold them to its own ways. And such was its power of absorption and assimilation that it succeeded in a measure in bringing about the cultural conquest of its conquerors. You must remember that the contest was not between the Indo-Aryan civilization and the highly civilized Arab. The contest was between civilized but decadent India and the semi-civilized and occasionally nomadic people from Central Asia who had themselves recently been converted to Islam. Unhappily, India connected Islam with this lack of civilization and with the horrors of Mahmud's raids, and bitterness grew. Dear friends and students, you are listening to the book Glimpses of World History by the legendary Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Chapter 52, The Countries of Europe Take Shape. June 3rd, 1932. Shall we pay a visit to Europe now, my dear? When we were there last, it was in a bad way. The collapse of Rome had meant the collapse of civilization in Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, except for that part of it which was under the Constantinople government, conditions were even worse. Attila the Hun had spread fire and destruction over a good part of the continent. But the Eastern Roman Empire, though declining, had endured, and had even shown occasional bursts of energy. In the West, things began to settle down in a new way after the shake-up which the fall of Rome gave. It took a long time to settle down, but one can just make out the new pattern as it develops. Christianity spreads, helped sometimes by its saints and men of peace, sometimes by the sword of its warrior kings. New kingdoms rise up. In France and Belgium and part of Germany, the Franks, whom you must not confuse with the French yet, formed a kingdom under a ruler named Clovis, who ruled from 481 to 511 AC. This is called the Merovingian line, from the name of Clovis's grandfather. But these kings were soon put into the shade by an official of their own court, the mayor of the palace. These mayors became all-powerful and became hereditary mayors. They were the real rulers. The so-called kings were just puppets. It was one of these mayors of the palace, Charles Martel, who defeated the Saracens at the Great Battle of Tours in France in 732 AC. By this victory, he stopped the Saracen wave of conquest and, in Christian eyes, he saved Europe. His prestige and reputation gained greatly by this. He was looked up to as the champion of Christendom against the enemy. The popes of Rome were not then on good terms with the Constantinople emperor. So they began to look up to Charles Martel for help. His son Pepin decided to call himself king and remove the puppet who was there. And the Pope, of course, gladly agreed. Pepin's son was Charlemagne. The Pope was in trouble again, and he invited Charlemagne to come to his rescue. Charles did so and drove away his enemies. And on Christmas Day, 800 AC, there was a great ceremony in the cathedral when the Pope crowned Charlemagne Roman Emperor. From that day began the Holy Roman Empire, of which I wrote to you once before. It was a strange empire, and its later history is stranger still, as it vanishes gradually like the Cheshire Cat in Alice, leaving just the smile behind with no trace of body. But this was yet to come, and we need not pry into the future. This Holy Roman Empire was not a continuation of the old Western Roman Empire. It was something different. It considered itself the empire, the emperor being boss over everybody else in the world, except perhaps the Pope. Between the emperor and Pope, there was for many centuries a contest as to who was the greater. But this also was to come later. What is interesting to note is that this new empire was supposed to be a revival of the old Roman Empire, when this was supreme, and Rome was said to be the mistress of the world. But to this was added a new idea, that of Christianity and Christendom. Hence the empire was holy. The emperor was supposed to be a kind of viceroy of God on earth, and so was the Pope. One dealt with political matters, the other with spiritual. This was the idea at any rate, and it was from this, I suppose, that the idea of the divine right of kings arose in Europe. The emperor was the defender of the faith. You will be interested to know that the English king is still styled the defender of the faith. Compare this emperor with the Khalifa or Caliph, who was styled the commander of the faithful. The Khalifa was really an emperor and pope combined to begin with. Later, as we shall see, he became just a figurehead. The Constantinople emperors, of course, did not at all approve of this newly arisen Holy Roman Empire in the West. At the time that Charlemagne was crowned, a woman, Irene, had made herself empress at Constantinople. She was the creature who killed her own son to become empress, and things were in a bad way in her time. This was one of the reasons which emboldened the Pope to break away from Constantinople by crowning Charlemagne. Charlemagne was now the head of Western Christendom, the viceroy of God on earth, the emperor of a holy empire. How pompous these phrases sound! But they serve their purpose by deluding and hypnotizing the people. By calling God and religion to its help, authority has often enough sought to fool others and increase its own power. The king and the emperor and the high priest become, for the average person, vague and shadowy beings, almost like the gods, far removed from ordinary life. And this mystery makes him afraid of them. Compare the elaborate codes and etiquettes and ceremonial of courts with the equally elaborate ceremonial of worship in temple or church. There is the same bowing and scraping and prostration, kowtowing as the Chinese say. From childhood up, we are taught this worship of authority in various forms. It is the service of fear, not of love. Charlemagne was the contemporary of Harun al-Rashid of Baghdad. He corresponded with him and, note this, he actually suggested an alliance between the two to fight the Eastern Roman Empire as well as the Saracens in Spain. Nothing seems to have come of this suggestion. But even so, it throws a flood of light on the working of the minds of kings and politicians. Imagine the Holy Emperor, the head of Christendom, joining hands with the Caliph at Baghdad against a Christian power and an Arab power. You will remember that the Saracens of Spain had refused to recognize the Abbasid caliphs of Baghdad. They had become independent, and Baghdad had a grievance against them. But they were too far apart for conflict. Between Constantinople and Charlemagne, there was also not much love lost. Here also, distance prevented any actual fighting. Nonetheless, the proposal was made for the Christian and the Arab to join together to fight another Christian and another Arab power. The real motives at the back of kings' minds were those of gaining power and authority and wealth. But religion was often made the cloak for this. Everywhere this has been so. In India, we saw Mahmud coming in the name of religion, but making a good thing out of it. The cry of religion has paid often enough. But people's ideas change from age to age, and it is very difficult for us to judge of others who lived long ago. We must remember this. Many things that seem obvious to us today would have been very strange to them, and their habits and ways of thinking would seem strange to us. While people talked of high ideals and the Holy Empire, and the Viceroy of God, and the Pope who was Vicar of Christ, conditions in the West were as bad as they could well be. Soon after Charlemagne's reign, Italy and Rome were in a disgraceful condition. A disgusting lot of men and women did what they liked in Rome, and made and unmade popes. Indeed, it was the general disorder in Western Europe, which had prevailed since the fall of Rome, that induced many people to think that if the empire were revived, conditions would improve. It became also a matter of prestige with many that they should have an emperor. One old writer of those days says that Charles was made emperor lest the pagans should insult the Christians if the name of emperor should have ceased among the Christians. Charlemagne's empire included France, Belgium, Holland, Switzerland, half Germany, and half Italy. To the southwest of it was Spain under the Arabs. To the northeast were the Slav and other tribes. To the north, the Danes and Northmen. To the southeast, the Bulgarians and Serbians. And beyond them, the Eastern Roman Empire under Constantinople. Charlemagne died in 814, and soon afterwards, troubles arose for a division of the spoils of empire. His descendants, who are called the Carlovingians, Carolus, the Latin for Charles, were not up to much, as can be gathered from the titles of some of them: the Fat, the Bald, the Pious. From the division of Charlemagne's empire, we now see Germany and France shaping themselves. Germany is supposed to date as a nation from 843 AC, and it is said that it was the Emperor Otto the Great who reigned from 962 to 973, who made the Germans more or less a single people. France was already no part of Otto's empire. In 987, Hugh Capet drove away the feeble Carlovingian kings and obtained control of France. This was not much in the way of control, as France was divided up into big areas under independent nobles, and they often fought each other. But they feared the emperor and pope more than each other, and united to resist them. With Hugh Capet, France begins as a nation, and even in these early beginnings, we can see the rivalry between France and Germany, which has endured for 1,000 years, right up to our day. Strange that two neighboring countries and peoples so cultured and highly endowed as the French and the Germans should go on nursing this ancient feud from generation to generation. But perhaps the fault is not so much theirs as that of the systems under which they have lived. About this time, Russia also comes upon the stage in history. Rurik, a man from the north, is said to have laid the foundations of the Russian state about 850 AC. In the southeast of Europe, we find the Bulgarians settling down, and indeed becoming rather aggressive. Also the Serbians. The Magyars or Hungarians and the Poles also begin to form states between the Holy Roman Empire and the new Russia. Meanwhile, from northern Europe, men came down in ships to the western and southern countries and burned and killed and looted. You have read of the Danes and other Northmen who went to England to harry and sack. These Northmen, or Norsemen, or Normans as they came to be called, went to the Mediterranean, sailed up the big rivers in their ships, and wherever they went, they robbed and killed and looted. There was anarchy in Italy, and Rome was in a deplorable condition. They sacked Rome and threatened even Constantinople. These robbers and plunderers seized the northwest of France, where Normandy is, and South Italy and Sicily, and gradually settled down there and became lords and landowners, as robbers often do when they are prosperous. It was these Normans from Normandy in France that went and conquered England in 1066 AC under William, known as the Conqueror. So we see England also taking shape. We have now arrived roughly at the end of the first millennium, or 1,000 years of the Christian era in Europe. About this time, Mahmud of Ghazni was raiding India, and about this time, the Abbasid caliphs of Baghdad were breaking up and the Seljuk Turks were reviving Islam in Western Asia. Spain continued to be under the Arabs, but they were cut off completely from their homelands in Arabia, and indeed were not on good terms with the Baghdad rulers. North Africa was practically independent of Baghdad. In Egypt, there was not only an independent government, but a separate caliphate. And for some time, the Egyptian caliph ruled over North Africa also. Dear friends and students, you are listening to the book Glimpses of World History by the legendary Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Chapter 53, The Feudal System, June 4th, 1932. In our last letter, we had a glimpse of the beginnings of France and Germany and Russia and England as we know them today. But do not imagine that people in those days thought of these countries in the same way as we do now. We think of different nations, of Englishmen and Frenchmen and Germans, and each one of these thinks of his country as his motherland or fatherland or patrie. This is the feeling of nationality which is so obvious in the world today. Our struggle for freedom in India is our national struggle. But this idea of nationality did not exist in those days. There was some idea of Christendom, of belonging to a group or society of Christians as against the heathen or Muslims. In the same way, the Muslims had the idea of belonging to the world of Islam as against all others who were unbelievers. But these ideas of Christendom and Islam were vague notions which did not touch the daily life of the people. Only on special occasions were they worked up to fill the people with religious zeal to fight for Christianity or Islam, as the case might be. Instead of nationality, there was a peculiar relation between man and man. This was the feudal relation arising out of what is known as the feudal system. After the downfall of Rome, the old order in the West had collapsed. There was disorder and anarchy and violence and force everywhere. The strong seized what they could and held on to it as long as a stronger person did not come to throw them out. Strong castles were built, and the lords of these castles went out with raiding parties and harried the countryside, and sometimes fought others like themselves. The poor peasants and workers on the land, of course, suffered the most. Out of this disorder grew up the feudal system. The peasants were not organized and could not defend themselves against these robber barons. There was no central government strong enough to protect them. So they made the best of a bad job and came to terms with the lord of the castle who plundered them. They agreed to give him part of what they produced in their fields, and also to serve him in some ways, provided that he would not plunder and harass them, and would protect them from others of his kind. The lord of the small castle, in the same way, came to terms with the lord of the bigger castle. But the little lord could not give the big lord the produce of the field, as he was not a peasant or a producer. So he promised to give him military service, that is, to fight for him whenever need arose. In return, the big one was to protect the little one, and the latter was the vassal of the lord. And so, step by step, they went up to yet bigger lords and nobles, till at last they arrived at the king at the top of this feudal structure. But they did not stop even there. To them, even heaven had its own bit of
the feudal system with its trinity, presided over by God. This was the system that grew up gradually out of the disorder that prevailed in Europe. You must remember that there was practically no central government at the time. There were no policemen or the like. The owner of a piece of land was the governor and lord of it,
as well as of all the people who lived upon it. He was a kind of little king and was supposed to protect them in return for their service and part of the produce of their fields. He was the liege lord of these people, who were called villeins or serfs. In theory, he held his land from his superior lord, whose vassal he was, and to whom he gave military service. Even the officials of the church were parts of the feudal system. They were both priests and feudal lords. Thus, in Germany, nearly half the land and wealth was in the hands of the bishops and abbots. The Pope was himself a feudal lord. This whole system, you will notice, was one of gradations and classes. There was no question of equality. At the bottom were the villeins or serfs, and they had to carry the whole weight of the social structure. The little lords and the big lords, and the bigger lords and the king. And the whole cost of the church, of the bishops and abbots and cardinals and ordinary priests, fell on them also. The lords, little or big, did not do any work which might produce food or any other kind of wealth. This was considered beneath them. Fighting was their chief occupation, and when not engaged in this, they hunted or indulged in mock fights and tournaments. They were a rough and illiterate lot, who did not know many ways of amusing themselves besides fighting and eating and drinking. Thus, the whole burden of producing the food and the other necessaries of life fell on the peasants and the artisans. At the top of the whole system was the king, who was supposed to be a kind of vassal of God. This was the idea behind this feudal system. In theory, the lords were bound to protect their vassals and serfs, but in practice, they were a law unto themselves. Their superiors, or the king, seldom checked them, and the peasantry were too weak to resist their demands. Being far the stronger, they took from their serfs the utmost they could, and left them barely enough to carry on a miserable existence. That has been the way of owners of land always and in every country. The ownership of land has given nobility. The robber knight who seized land and built a castle became a noble lord respected by everybody. This ownership has also given power, and the owner has used this power to take away as much from the peasant and the producer or the worker as he could. Even the laws have helped the owners of land, for the laws have been made by them and their friends. And this is the reason why many people think that land should not belong to individuals, but to the community. If it belongs to the state or community, that means that it belongs to all who live there, and no one can then exploit others on it or get an unfair advantage. But these ideas were yet to come. During the time of which we are speaking, people did not think along these lines. The masses of the people were miserable, but they saw no way out of their difficulties. They put up with them, therefore, and carried on their life of hopeless labor. The habit of obedience had been dinned into them, and once this is done, people will put up with almost anything. So we find a society growing up, consisting of the feudal lords and their retainers on the one side, and the very poor on the other. Round the stone castle of the lord would cluster the mud or wooden huts of the serfs. There were two worlds, far removed from each other: the world of the lord and the world of the serf. And the lord probably considered the serf as only some degrees removed from the cattle he tended. Sometimes the smaller priests tried to protect the serfs from the lords. But as a rule, the priests and clergy sided with the lords, And as a matter of fact, the bishops and abbots were themselves feudal lords. In India, we have not had this kind of feudal system, but we have had something similar to it. Indeed, our Indian states, with their rulers and nobles and lordlings, still preserve many feudal customs. The Indian caste system, though wholly different from the feudal system, yet divided society into classes. In China, as I think I have told you, there has never been any autocracy,
Privileged class of this kind. By their ancient system of examinations, they opened the gate to the highest office to each individual. But of course, in practice, there may have been many restrictions. In the feudal system, there was thus no idea of equality or of freedom. There was an idea of rights and obligations. That is, a feudal lord received as his right service and part of the produce of the land, and considered it as his obligation to give protection. But rights are always remembered, and obligations are often ignored. We have even now great landowners in some European countries and in India who take enormous sums as rent from their tenants without doing a scrap of work. But all idea of any obligation has long been forgotten. It is strange to notice how the old barbarian tribes of Europe, who were so fond of their freedom, gradually resigned themselves to this feudal system which denied it completely. These tribes used to elect their chiefs and to hold them in check. Now we find despotism and autocracy everywhere, and no question of election. I cannot say why this change occurred. It may be that the doctrines spread by the church helped the spread of undemocratic ideas. The king became the shadow of God on earth. And how can you disobey or argue with even the shadow of the Almighty? The feudal system seemed to include heaven and earth in its fold. In India also, we find the old Aryan ideas of freedom gradually changing. They become weaker and weaker till they are almost forgotten. But in the early Middle Ages, as I showed you, they were still remembered to some extent, as the Vishwara of Shukracharya and the South Indian inscriptions tell us. Some freedom slowly came to Europe again through the new forms that were rising up. Besides the owners of land and those who worked on it, the lords and their serfs, there were other classes of people, artisans and traders. These people as such were not part of the feudal system. In the period of disorder, there was little enough trade and handicrafts did not flourish. But gradually trade increased and the importance of master craftsmen and merchants grew. They became wealthy and the lords and barons went to them to borrow money. They lent the money, but they insisted on the lords allowing them certain privileges. These privileges added to their strength. So we find now, instead of the serfs' huts clustering round the lord's castle, little towns growing up with houses all round a cathedral or church or guild hall. The merchants and artisans formed guilds or associations, and the headquarters of these associations became the guild halls, which later became the town halls. These cities that were growing up, Cologne and Frankfurt and Hamburg and many others, became rivals of the power of the feudal lords. A new class was growing up in them, the merchant and trading class, which was wealthy enough to defy even the nobles. It was a long struggle, and often the king, afraid of the power of his own nobles and barons, sided with the cities. But I am going too far ahead. I began this letter by telling you
that there was no feeling of nationality in those days. People thought of their duty and allegiance to their superior lord. They had taken the oath to serve him, not the country. Even the king was a vague person, too far away. If the lord rebelled against the king, that was his lookout. His vassals had to follow him. This was very different from the idea of nationality, which was to come much later. Dear friends and students, you are listening to the book Glimpses of World History by the legendary Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Chapter 54. China pushes the Nomads to the West. June 5th, 1932. I have not written to you about China and the Far Eastern countries for a long time. Nearly a month, I think. We have discussed many changes in Europe and India and Western Asia. We have watched the Arabs spread out and conquer many lands, and Europe fall back into darkness and struggle to come out of it. All this time, China was, of course, carrying on and, as a rule, carrying on rather well. In the 7th and 8th centuries, China under the Tang emperors was probably the most civilized and prosperous and the best governed country in the world. Europe, of course, could not be compared with it, as it was very backward after the collapse of Rome. North India was at a low ebb for most of the time. She had her bright periods, as when Harsha ruled, but on the whole she was going downhill. South India was certainly more vigorous than the north, and across the seas, her colonies, Angkor and Sri Vijaya, were on the eve of a great period. The only states that could rival China during this period, in some respects, were the two Arab states of Baghdad and Spain. But even these were at the height of their glory for a comparatively short period. It is interesting to note, however, that a Tang emperor who had been driven away from his throne appealed to the Arabs for help, and it was through their help that he regained power. So China was well in the van of civilization in those days, and could with some justification regard the Europeans of the time as a set of semi-barbarians. In the known world, she was supreme. I say the known world because I do not know what was happening then in America. This we know, that both in Mexico and in Peru and the neighboring countries, civilizations had been existing for several hundred years. In some respects, they were remarkably advanced. In other respects, they appear to have been just as remarkably backward. But I know so little about them that I dare not say much. I should like you, however, to keep them in mind. The Maya civilization of Mexico and Central America, and the Peruvian state of the Incas. Others, wiser than I am, may tell you something worthwhile about them. I must confess that they fascinate me, but my fascination is only equaled by my ignorance of them. Another matter I should like you to remember. We have seen in the course of our letters that many nomadic tribes have appeared in Central Asia and gone west to Europe or descended on India. The Huns, the Scythians, the Turks, and many others have gone, one after another, in wave after wave. You will remember the White Huns who came to India and Attila's Huns in Europe. The Seljuk Turks who took possession of the Baghdad Empire also came from Central Asia. Later, another branch of the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, were to come and finally conquer Constantinople and go right up to the walls of Vienna. Out of Central Asia or Mongolia also were to come the terrible Mongols who conquered right up to the heart of Europe, and even brought China under their rule, and one of whose descendants was to found a dynasty and an empire in India which was to produce some famous rulers. With these nomadic tribes of Central Asia and Mongolia, China waged ceaseless war. Or perhaps it would be more correct to say that these nomads were almost always giving trouble to China, and China was obliged to defend itself. It was to protect itself against these that the Great Wall was built. It did some good, no doubt, but it was poor enough protection against raids. Emperor after emperor had to drive back the nomads, and it was in this process of driving back that the Empire of China spread far into the west, right up to the Caspian Sea, as I have told you. The Chinese people were not given overmuch to imperialism. Some of their emperors were certainly imperialists and ambitious of conquest. But compared to many other peoples, they were peace-loving and not fond of war and conquest. The learned man in China has always had more honor and glory than the warrior. If in spite of this the Chinese empire became very extensive at times, it was largely due to irritation against the continuous pinpricks and raids of the nomads to the north and west. The strong emperors drove them far to the west to get rid of them once for all. They did not solve the question forever, but they got some relief at least. But the relief the people of China got was at the expense of other peoples and countries. For the nomads who were driven out by the Chinese went and attacked other countries. They came to India. They went to Europe again and again. The drives of the Han emperors of China gave other countries the Huns and the Tatars and other nomads. The Tangs presented the Turks to Europe. So far, the Chinese had succeeded to a large extent in defending themselves from these nomadic tribes. We shall now come to a period when they were not so successful. The Tang dynasty, as always happens with these dynasties everywhere, gradually tapered off into a number of incompetent rulers, who had none of the strong points of their predecessors, but only their love of luxury. Corruption spread in the state, and this was accompanied by heavy taxation, which of course fell mostly on the poorer classes. Discontent increased, and at the beginning of the 10th century, in 907 AC, the dynasty fell. For half a century, there was a succession of petty and unimportant rulers. In 960 AC, however, another of China's big dynasties begins. This was the Sung dynasty, founded by Cao Tzu. But trouble, both at the frontiers and in the interior of China, continued. The heavy land taxes were a great burden on the peasantry and were much resented. As in India, the whole land system was too much of a burden for the people, and there could be no peace or progress till this was completely changed. But it is always difficult to make these root and branch changes. The people at the top profit by the existing system and shout a lot when change is proposed. But if the change is not made in time, it has a habit of coming without invitation and of upsetting the whole apple cart. The Tang dynasty fell because it did not make the necessary changes. The Sungs had continuous troubles also because of this. One man arose who might have succeeded. He was Wang An-shi, a prime minister of the Sungs in the 11th century. China was, as I have told you, a land governed by the ideas of Confucius. All officials had to pass examinations in the Confucian classics, and nobody dared to go against anything that Confucius had said. Wang An-shi did not go against them, but he interpreted them in a remarkable way. That is a way clever people have of getting round a difficulty. Some of Wang's ideas were remarkably modern. His whole object was to lessen the burden of taxation on the poor and increase it on the rich who could afford to pay. He lowered the land taxes and permitted the peasants to pay them in kind, that is, in grain or other produce, if they found payment in money difficult. On the rich, he levied an income tax. This is supposed to be quite a modern tax, and yet we find it proposed in China 900 years ago. To help the farmers, Wang proposed that the government should lend them money which could be repaid at harvest time. Another difficulty which had to be got over was the rise and fall of the price of grain. When the market price falls, the poor peasants can get very little for the produce of their fields. They cannot sell it, and thus have no money with which to pay taxes or to buy anything. Wang Anshi tried to face this problem and suggested that the government should buy and sell grain to keep the price from rising and falling. Wang also proposed that there should be no forced labor for public works, and that every man who worked must be paid his full wage. He also instituted a local militia called the Pao Chia. But Wang was unfortunately too far ahead of his times, and after a while his reforms lapsed. Only the militia continued for more than 800 years. Not being bold enough to solve the problems that faced them, the Songs gradually succumbed to them. The northern barbarians, the Khitans, were too much for them. Unable to drive them back, they asked another tribe from the northwest, the Kins or the Golden Tartars, to come to their help. The Kins came and drove out the Khitans, but they stayed themselves and refused to budge. That is often the fate of a weak person or country seeking aid from a strong one. The Kins made themselves masters of northern China and made Peking their capital. The Songs retired to the south and went on shrinking before the advancing Kins. Thus, there was a Qin Empire in northern China and the Sung Empire in southern China. These Songs were called the Southern Songs. The Sung dynasty in the north lasted from 960 to 1127 AC. The Southern Songs ruled in southern China for 150 years, till the Mongols came and put an end to them in 1260 AC. But China, as India of old, retaliated by absorbing and assimilating even the Mongols and making them almost typical Chinamen. So China succumbed at last to the nomad tribes. But even in the process of doing so, it civilized them, and so did not suffer from them as other parts of Asia and Europe did. The Songs in the north and in the south were not politically as powerful as their predecessors, the Tangs. But they carried on the artistic tradition of the great days of the Tangs, and indeed improved upon it. South China, under the Southern Songs, excelled in art and poetry, and beautiful paintings were made, especially of scenes from nature, for the Sung artists loved nature. Porcelain also appears, made beautiful by the touch of the artist's fingers. This was
To become more and more beautiful and wonderful, until, 200 years later, under the Ming monarchs, marvelously fine porcelain was produced. A vase of the Ming period in China is even today a thing of rare delight. Dear friends and students, you are listening to the book Glimpses of World History by the legendary Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Chapter 55. The Shogun Rules in Japan. June 6, 1932. From China, it is easy to cross the Yellow Sea and visit Japan. And now that we are so near to it, we might as well do so. Do you remember our last visit? We saw the rise of great families fighting for mastery, and a central government coming more and more into evidence. The emperor, from being the chief of a big and powerful clan, became the head of the central government. Nara, the capital, was established as a symbol of central authority. And then the capital was changed to Kyoto. Chinese methods of government were copied, and much was taken from, or via, China art, religion, politics. Even the name of the country, Dai Nippon, came from China. We saw also a powerful family, the Fujiwara family, seizing all the power and treating the emperors as puppets. For 200 years they ruled, until the emperors got desperate and abdicated and entered monasteries. But in spite of becoming a monk, the ex-emperor interfered a great deal in the affairs of government by advising the reigning emperor, who was his son. By this method, the emperors managed to get round the Fujiwara family to some extent. It was rather a complicated way of doing things, but anyhow, it succeeded in reducing the power of the Fujiwaras. The real power lay with the emperors, who abdicated one after the other and became monks. They are called, therefore, the cloistered emperors. Meanwhile, however, other changes took place, and a new class of large landholders, who were also military men, arose. The Fujiwaras had created these landholders and asked them to collect taxes for the government. They were called daimyos, which means great names. It is curious to compare this with the rise of a similar class in our province just before the British came. In Oudh, especially, the king, who was a weakling, appointed tax collectors. These people kept little armies of their own to help them to collect forcibly, and of course they kept most of the collections for themselves. These tax collectors, in some cases, developed into the big talukdars. The daimyos became very powerful with their retainers and little armies, and fought each other and ignored the central government at Kyoto. The two chief daimyo families were the Taira and the Minamoto. They helped the emperor in suppressing the Fujiwaras in 1156 AC. But then they attacked each other. The Tairas won, and perhaps to make sure that the rival family would not trouble them in future, they killed them. They killed all the leading Minamotos except 4 children, one of these being a 12-year-old boy, Yoritomo. The Taira family, in spite of their attempts, had not been thorough enough. This boy, Yoritomo, who was spared as of no great consequence, grew up a bitter enemy of the Taira family, full of the desire for vengeance. He succeeded. He drove them out of the capital, and then smashed them up at a naval battle. Yoritomo now became all-powerful, and the emperor gave him the high-sounding title of Sei-Tai Shogun, which means the barbarians subduing great general. This was in 1192 AC. The title was hereditary, and with it went full power to govern. The shogun was the real ruler. In this way began the shogunate in Japan. It was to last a very long time,
nearly 700 years, almost to recent times, when modern Japan was to rise out of her feudal shell. But this does not mean that Yoritomo's descendants ruled as shoguns for 700 years. There were several changes in the families out of which shoguns came. There was civil war repeatedly, but the system of the shogun being the real ruler and governing in the name of an emperor who had little or no power continued for this long period. Often it so happened that even the shogun became a mere figurehead, and a number of officials held the power. Yoritomo was afraid of living in the luxury of the capital, Kyoto, as he felt that soft living would weaken him and his colleagues. So he established his military capital at Kamakura, and this first shogunate is called therefore the Kamakura Shogunate. It lasted till 1333 AC, that is, for nearly 150 years. Japan had peace during
Most of this period. After the many years of civil war, the peace was very welcome, and there was an era of prosperity. The condition of Japan during this period was certainly much better, and the government was more efficient than that of any country of contemporary Europe. Japan was an apt pupil of China, although there was a vast difference in the two outlooks. China, as I have said, was an essentially peaceful and quiet country. Japan, on the other hand, was an aggressive military country. In China, a soldier was looked down upon, and the trade of fighting was not considered very honorable. In Japan, the topmost men were soldiers, and the ideal was that of a daimyo or fighting knight. So Japan took much from China, but took it in its own way and adapted and molded everything to suit its racial genius. Intimate contacts with China continued, and so did trade, chiefly on Chinese ships. There was a sudden stop to this towards the end of the 13th century, for the Mongols had come to China and Korea. The Mongols even attempted to conquer Japan, but they were repulsed. Thus the Mongols, who changed the face of Asia and shook Europe, had no marked effect on Japan. Japan carried on in her old way, cut off even more than before from external influences. There is a story in the old official annals of Japan of how the cotton plant first came to the country. It is said that some Indians who were shipwrecked near the coast of Japan brought the cotton seeds in 799 AC. The tea plant came later. It was first introduced early in the 9th century, but it had no success then. In 1191, a Buddhist monk brought seeds of the tea plant from China, and very soon tea became popular. This drinking of tea created a demand for fine pottery. Late in the 13th century, a Japanese potter went to China to study the art of making porcelain. He spent 6 years there. On his return, he started making fine Japanese porcelain. Tea drinking is now a fine art in Japan, and there is an elaborate ceremonial about it. When you go to Japan, you must drink it the right way, or you will be considered a bit of a barbarian. Dear friends and students, till now, you were listening to the book Glimpses of World History by the legendary Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Please subscribe to channel and help us grow. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.